So tonight we begin a 5-week series on starting over. How many of you have ever had to start over? Did you love it? Okay, so we're going to talk about starting over from a spiritual point of view. Because the truth is, you're going to have to start over multiple times in your life. From big start overs to little start overs, but you're going to have to start over. And when we understand it as a spiritual process, it makes all the difference in the world. True? Okay, so you ready? We're going to talk about starting over. Because for most of us, when we talk about starting over, we feel like there must have been a mistake somewhere along the way. That for most of us, starting over tends to feel like there was a mistake either that we made or that the universe made or that somebody else made, because we've been taught over and over again that to start over is at some level wrong or bad. But what if starting over is really a part of a spiritual process? And what if starting over really is an invitation to go deeper into God? See, in the moment we actually have to start over, there tends to be such a high level of personal resistance. Right? Can you think of a time when you had to start over? Now, did you go, woo, like, let's go for it. Let's rodeo, God. Let's see what good you have for me. I want to get into this. I want to learn everything. I want to experience everything. I want it all. Don't hold anything back from me. Or did you go, oh, no. This is not what my life is supposed to look like. Right? I have a plan. I'm clear about my plan. And this is not a part of my big picture plan for my life. And so what I want you to see over and over again is that starting over, it really does take us to our most vulnerable place, where we actually need God the most. Because when we are starting over, we move from having a concept of God to really needing God. See, it's actually easier to believe in God as an abstract idea than it is actually allowing a spiritual power to be in charge of your life. It's actually easier to talk about God than it is trust God in the midst of a failure or a disappointment or a breakup or an ending. It's in those moments where God isn't an intellectual idea, but it's something that we have to hang on to in the very place where we need it the most. See, for most of us, we're going to go through many more events of starting over than culturally we did 100 years ago. You know, there's a couple kind of ways that we have to start over. The end of a relationship, the end of a career, the loss of a job, the loss of a business, bankruptcy, even a major opportunity can be a starting over, or an illness. And then there's all the minor starting overs, a new relationship, a new home, spiritual awakening, a promotion. There's all these levels where we have to start over. And when we look at the world from 100 years ago, things tended to be a little bit more stable. If you look at the world 100 years ago, you know, a lot of times people were born and raised in the same town, and they stayed there. You might have the job that your father had, or you might, you know, have things much more predictable. But in our culture today, things are transforming at such an amazing rate that when we look at it, do you know the average person right now will move 11.7 times in their lifetime? 11.7 times. That's a lot of movement. right? The average person will have 10 jobs before they get to 40. 10 jobs before they get to 40. You think, please, I had 10 jobs last year. Right? The average male will have 6 significant relationships in his lifetime. I don't want to hear it, right? The average female will have 5 significant relationships, and they define significant as relationships that lasted from over 3 to 6 months. You define significant how you want to define significant. But the researchers define a significant relationship is one that lasted over 6 months, right? So it wasn't like a casual dating thing. This was like a relationship. Now, before I lose all control of this service, I want you to see that the world is actually transforming quicker than it ever has before. And the question that I want to put before you tonight is, can you see that as a spiritual process instead of that you've done something wrong? Because for so many of us, we think if we get to an ending, we did something wrong. And what if we can do a much better job at having good endings that lead to great new beginnings? Do you know, even in Scripture, there is this invitation to start over? There's a story in the New Testament about a rich young ruler that comes to Jesus in Matthew 19. And he says, what do I need to do to inherit eternal life? And he says, oh, go live the commandments. And he said, that's a paraphrase, but it's pretty much you know, I've been doing that since I was a kid. What else you got? And in my mind, I can see Jesus looking directly into his heart and his soul and saying, okay, then sell everything you have and come and follow me. Not because he wanted that rich young man broke, but because he wanted him to know God is your source. And see, one of the things that happens over and over again in starting over is that you have to really begin to look at who you're depending upon and what you're depending upon. Because if you're just depending on your own personality, your own ego, your own sense of yourself, sometimes it's a pretty scary thing to be starting over. Because you know you can't do it by yourself. And that you need something much bigger than you, your personality, to hang on to. Paul in 1 Corinthians says, I must die daily. Right? And so spiritually, there's this idea that over and over and over again, whoever you think you are, whatever you think you're about, whatever life that you've figured out that you're creating, there's this constant process. There's this regular process where you let go of what is to open a space for something bigger, which is by far the Easter message, right? That we die to the old and we're reborn into something even greater. And over again, in that moment where we're actually going through those experiences of dying to the old and being reborn, it can be the scariest moment of our lives. Because there's a part of us that has such difficulty believing that we could be more than what we've been. That we could have a greater life than we've already known. That we can actually walk in a closer relationship with the divine. So over the next 5 weeks, I want us to walk through a process of how do we use starting over as a spiritual experience? How do we deepen our spiritual experience as we allow something to be brand new? How do we die to the old so that we can be reborn in a greater way? So the first requirement is really the question about how do we start over? Right? What's the requirement for starting over? Anybody? Got to do something different. But to start over, what is required? You got to have an ending. Right. Bing, bing, bing. You got to have an ending, right? So to actually start over, you actually have to have an ending, right? And one of the things I want you to see that as a spiritual person, that everything in life has a beginning, a middle, and an end. Everything. If you're an eternal being, right, you're not going to ride any ride forever. And I want to really open a space that we make peace with that. That in every situation, there's a beginning, a middle, and an end. One time, you know who Ram Dass is? Heard Ram Dass in a lecture one time, and he's holding a glass of water in this lecture, and he said, there is so much sadness in the world. And somebody said to him, well, how do you overcome that? And he's holding this glass of water, and he said, well, in my mind, I know this glass is going to break. There's going to be a day when this glass is not this glass. He said, but that doesn't keep me from enjoying the glass fully and completely now, knowing that it's not going to last forever. How many of you have ever bought a new car? How many of you, about 10 minutes after you bought your new car, already noticed the first scratch or the first little ding or the first little thing, and it's like, no, I'm just going to put bubble wrap all over my car and just park it in the garage. If I could get it in the garage, I would just park it in the garage, right? And so I'm just going to make payments on it so it always looks perfect, right? And then I'm only going to park it or drive it like after 3 o'clock in the morning so that no one else could possibly touch my new car. So tonight, what is the area in your life that you know it's time for you to have an ending? So there's 4 points that I want to talk about tonight. The first one is telling yourself the truth. And before you can have an honest conversation with anyone else, guess who you have to have an honest conversation with? Yourself, right? So one of the things that happens is that we prevent ourselves from having endings by staying in bad situations. Have you ever stayed in a bad situation simply because you didn't want it to end? And it could be a job, it could be a relationship, it could be a number of things, right? But we stay in it simply because we don't want it to end, so we never have to have a tough conversation. We never have to tell ourselves the truth, and we never have to tell anybody else the truth, so we stay in bad situations over and over again simply because we don't want to start over. Have you ever been in a situation that you knew, in a work situation, personal relationship, whatever, that you knew wasn't the highest and the best for you, but you stayed simply because you didn't want to, that starting over seemed so scary that you would rather be in a bad situation than starting over? And what I want you to see tonight is the greatest level of truth that we need to tell anyone is the truth that we need to tell ourselves. That your soul is speaking to you tonight about what the highest and the best is for you. Just for you. And are you willing to listen in such a way that you get to hear it? You get to actually hear what your own soul is saying to you. That sometimes we're so afraid about having a conversation with somebody else that we don't have the conversation with ourselves. So if you told yourself the truth tonight, is there any area in your life where you can see it's coming to an end? Is there any area in your life that you've actually outgrown? See, the interesting thing about being a soul is that your soul is evolving. It's supposed to keep evolving. And as an evolving soul, there's times and situations and moments where you've actually outgrown something, where it's no longer necessary or helpful, or isn't actually leading your soul to its next highest level of good. So we actually outgrow it. So we actually have to tell ourselves the truth that we're actually done. We completed that lesson. We've passed that grade. We've graduated. And now it's time for us to move on and start something new. And we have to be willing to tell ourselves that before we can communicate that with anybody else. And sometimes those conversations are the hardest conversations we have. But they have to start with you. Is there a conversation that your soul is trying to have with you that you're simply not picking up the receiver to listen to? Is there a way that your soul wants to grow more in something that has been wonderful or fabulous or terrible, but it's just time for it to be over? Now, one of my fears about doing this series is that tomorrow you're all going to go quit your job and end your relationships. Right? So I'm a little apprehensive about doing this talk because I don't want to, I'm like balancing the desire to set your soul free without the real discomfort of having to do it. Right? Because it is a challenge, right? When you see that there are things that, that where you have to have a conversation with somebody or a situation, that it's a challenge. But there's a moment where all I want tonight is for you to tell yourself the truth. That's it. I just want you to listen to your soul in what your soul is asking for you. Okay, so the first thing I want is for you to stop where you need to stop. Second thing I want is for you to tell yourself the truth. The third thing I want from you tonight is the reason that we usually don't want to tell ourselves the truth is if we tell ourselves the truth, what's going to happen? For most of us, if we tell ourselves the truth, then we move into a level of grief that we're trying desperately not to have, right? And so if we don't ever tell ourselves the truth, if we don't have those tough conversations, then we don't have to grieve, and we can just kind of keep patting everything down. And, it's not great, but it's my life, so we just keep trying to put the fires out as quickly as they come up. But the third thing that you kind of do is that sometimes in the process of starting over is you have to grieve. You have some feelings about it. I don't want feelings. I don't like feelings. Feelings are overrated, right? Nobody wants to have feelings. We just want happy, happy feelings. We don't want any other feelings, right? But if you're going to grieve, there's times when you have feelings, and that's why Joni teaches her grief workshop around here. And I really recommend the grief handbook as an incredible tool if there's grief, because I think grief is the number one undiagnosed problem in the world today. And what I see for all of us is that God has a better, higher level of good for all of us. And I'd like to suggest tonight that it's quite a bit better than you're currently believing. And yet the difficulty of letting go, of starting over, is so difficult for us that we stay stuck because we would rather have what we know than go through the feelings to get where God wants to take us. And the third thing I want to touch on, or the fourth thing I want to touch on tonight, is the concept of meaning. Now, meaning is an interesting thing because meaning for most of us is self-created, right? So let me give you an example. So say on the way home tonight you get a flat tire, right? Now, it's one thing to have to get out and fix your flat tire, right? But for most of us, that would be a small event if it didn't create a high level of a story of meaning within our own mind, right? So for most of us, the experience of ending or stopping or changing or transforming is actually a fairly simple process. If we can extricate ourselves from all the meaning that we have attached to ending, stopping, changing, making a move, that actually makes everything much more complicated. Right? So say tomorrow, and I'm not holding this for anyone in prayer, or this is, just say tomorrow that you found out that your job was over. Right? Now, dealing with that on just a regular experience level is not easy, but survivable. But when you attach all the levels of meaning that you place on yourself of what it means to get laid off, then it takes experience and makes it 100 times more difficult. So what I'm saying as a spiritual person is that you're going to have experiences, and this is going to sound terrible, that don't mean anything. See, and what's interesting is every great spiritual teacher had an experience of God. They would have these profound experiences of God. And yet their followers would come around after them telling everybody what it meant. Do you understand what I mean by that? So they would say, no, he had that experience because he only ate 1 grain of rice for 10 years. And it was that 1 grain of rice that was the thing that popped him open to a greater experience of God. They come in after the fact, and they create all this meaning around that person having a profound experience of God, when it was just a profound experience of God that allowed them to have a profound experience of God, that they don't need all the meaning. And over again, what we do in life is we tell all these stories about ourselves. We tell all these stories about others that really get in the way of us having these really powerful moments of transformation. And if you're going to start over, what I want you to see is all the meaning that you attach to starting over is 100% self-inflicted. Like the whole story is you lost your job. It wasn't because you were a bad person. It wasn't because God was punishing you. It wasn't because of all the other stories or meaning that we attach to it. You just lost your job. And if you could just lose your job without telling a big story around it, how they victimized you or how you victimized them or how this happened or how that happened, you could just have the experience, move through it relatively quickly, and create the next version of your life. But we get so trapped in the meaning of what things mean that we get lost in all the details and all the stories and all the drama and all the blah, 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 that instead of just starting over, we have to do this crazy dance for a while. So here's what I'm asking. I'm asking you to first tell yourself the truth. Where in your life, if there is a spot, do you realize it's time for a change? Where? Just pay attention. And then if you notice it's time for a change, I want you to ask God, what's the gentlest way for me to go through this change? Because what tends to happen when there's a change that our soul is being invited into and we resist it? Does that change get easier or harder? Does it become more dramatic or less dramatic? Does it become more painful or less painful, right? So I want you to tell yourself the truth. And in those situations where you know it's time for a change, I want you to ask God how to make that change in the greatest possible way. And if that change creates a level of grief within you, I want you to actually deal with it. I want you to do something with it. I want you to actually feel the feelings and let them go. And if you're in a time of change, I want you to subtract as much story, as much drama, as many of the blah, 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 blahs that you can subtract so you can just be in the experience with God. Because the truth is, God's never going to judge you right there. In the place where you need God the most, in that moment where you feel helpless and helpless, God's going to be with you right there. Not judging you. You said, well, you should have done it this way. But just being an infinitely loving presence that will guide you through anything. Will you say with me, I am willing to rise again. Together? I am willing to rise again. One more time like we mean it. I am willing to rise again. One more time. I am willing to rise again. Let's take that into prayer. And I invite you to open your mind, your heart, your soul to the activity of God. That today I absolutely want you to be asking for the courage to make the changes in your life that your soul wants to make. To listen to what's being spoken in your own soul. To know the truth and to allow the truth to set you free. That God has a plan for your life. That God has greater good for you than you can even imagine. And as we become willing to let go of the limitations, we become willing to let go of the past, we become willing to let go of those things that no longer serve our soul, that God has a plan for your life that is infinitely good. Jesus said, come and follow me. Come and follow me. This day, let go. And truly let God be in charge of your life. And so it is. Amen. As we're starting over, the first question becomes, who am I now? I know who I have been, but if we're really going to start over, it requires a fearless look at who we are now. And so that's where we're going to go next week. Are you ready? Okay. So do you have your homework? Do you have enough homework for this week? I think we have enough homework for this week. All right. So you ready for a great week?